Welcome to Teen Focus. I'm Sarah Kadalka.
And I'm Erin Gurley. Today we're here with Titanic enthusiast Robert Catalano. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming in. So, what got you interested with the Titanic?
Well, back in 2002, which was the 90th anniversary of the Titanic sinking, the Great Lakes Science Center offered, for the first time, the Titanic Artifact Exhibition. So items that actually were recovered from the seabed were brought to the United States, and they traveled around in exhibitions, and they're still doing that today. So I was lucky enough to be an actor to kind of bring the story of
Cool.
Titanic to life. So they asked me to portray an officer, so I decided to portray Second Officer Charles Herbert Lightoller, and he was actually the highest ranking surviving officer, and this is one of the boarding passes that they actually gave out during the Titanic Artifacts exhibition. So people would get one of these, and then at the end, you can actually look at the wall that listed all the people who survived and all the people who were lost and find out more about that person. So I've really been involved with Titanic since then, since 2002.
Oh, cool.
Now, did you know a lot before you started acting?
Not really at all. I had been volunteering for the steamship William G. Mather, the Maritime Museum that's now behind the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So I really liked learning more about large ships. So when I heard about the Titanic exhibition coming, I figured I need to get involved with this and see what it's about. So it was at the exhibition that I started doing research for my character to bring it to life for the patrons who came to see the exhibition.
Nice. So
Gotcha.
could you tell us a little bit about the character you portrayed then?
Well, Charles Herbert Lightoller, and here's a picture of me with some of the other actors there at the Great Lakes Science Center. And I really like this picture because in the background is the steamship Mather.
Right.
So the Mather has actually been floating since 1925. So I was actually the museum manager at the time. I was also acting at the exhibition. So I told people I was on board a ship that sank on its maiden voyage. And I was working on one that's still afloat after, at that time, over 80 years or so. So it was really interesting. So as far as my character goes, right here, this is Charles Herbert Lightoller. He was the highest ranking surviving officer. So the captain perished, and the first officer and the chief officer perished. So since he was the highest ranking surviving officer, there were inquiries in Washington, D.C. and in London, England afterwards, so he was one of the key witnesses.
Okay.
And his life is fascinating, which we don't have enough time to go into, but he was sailing since he was 13 years old. He served in World War I as a war hero, which was after the Titanic, and even in World War II, he rescued about 100 soldiers from Dunkirk in France on his little private yacht. So this guy had a very full life.
Now, how old was he when the Titanic sank?
He was 38 years old, and like he said, he had been sailing since he was 13 years old.
Wow.
Yeah.
So he was still young.
Yeah.
He was very young.
Talk about experience.
Yeah.
So who were some of the other passengers on board then?
Well, you might have heard of somebody named Molly Brown, although when you asked me that at the exhibition, I didn't know who you were talking about, because the person on board the ship was called Margaret J.J. Brown. So Molly Brown was a name that was invented after she passed away for the musical. So Margaret J.J. Brown was actually a very wealthy woman, and she wasn't necessarily seen in the best regards by some of high society, but one of the people she ended up meeting when she was in Europe traveling around before Titanic was John Jacob Astor. And I actually got to portray Colonel John Jacob Astor at the Broadview Heights Spotlight's production of Pilots of the Purple Twilight, which is a story about passengers on board Titanic the night that it sank. So these were examples of two of the very wealthy passengers on board.
Gotcha.
But the main reason that Titanic existed was this right here. So do you guys know what this is?
Yes, our Statue
Yes.
of Liberty.
And
We've
what
been
is-
taught well.
And what does it represent?
What does it represent?
States, some
Yes.
freedom, that type of stuff. Liberty, maybe? Is that what we're
Liberty,
going for?
exactly. And so basically it was put in New York Harbor because when immigrants came to this country and they came to New York Harbor, this is one of the first things that they saw. So the Titanic was actually built not necessarily to transport Margaret J.J. Molly Brown and Colonel John Jacob Astor. It was designed to transport immigrants to the United States. So that's why one of the reasons she was so large was to accommodate, hundreds and hundreds of third-class passengers.
Right.
So they were coming to the United States for a better life. So they would come from anywhere in the world. So on Titanic, every single continent of the world was represented on the Titanic. So people from South America, North America, Africa, Asia, Australia, Europe, they were all on board Titanic, and many of those people were the immigrants coming to the U.S.
Now, how many of these people survived?
Well, Titanic, believe it or not, on its maiden voyage was not completely booked.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Looks like it was overflowing.
Well, yeah, so it wasn't completely booked. So it had about 2,200 people on board, and they didn't have computer records back then, so we don't know 100% sure how many people there were. So of those 2,200 people, over 1,500 perished. So only about 700 people survived the sinking. So it was about a third.
Now,
oh, go ahead.
why was that? Like, were there not enough lifeboats, or?
Well, funny thing is, Titanic had more than enough lifeboats that the law required.
Oh.
So at the time, she was actually operated through the British Board of Trade, and the Board of Trade said that she needed to have so many lifeboats. She actually had 4 extra lifeboats than were required. The problem was the laws didn't keep up with the size of these ships, because Titanic was one of the largest ships. It was the largest ship afloat when she was launched, along with her sister ship, the Olympic. And so just by comparison, you can see this large model of Titanic here. Another typical ship of that day would be about this size.
Okay.
So obviously this one could carry a lot more passengers, but they never changed the requirements for the lifeboats.
So on both boats, they had the same lifeboats?
They had the same number of lifeboats. Titanic actually had a few more than that was actually required, but
Right.
it still wasn't enough, obviously.
Yeah.
Now, was there some sort of system for who got to go on those lifeboats when it finally did crash?
The primary way people got on board the lifeboats was the rule of women and children first.
Okay.
So you've probably heard that term before.
Yeah.
So on the starboard side of the ship, there was an officer, First Officer Murdoch, who was loading those, and he actually did women and children first, and then if there were men allowed, he actually would let the men get into the lifeboats.
Okay.
On the other side of the ship, the port side, Charles Lightoller, who was the second officer who I portrayed, he pretty much said women and children only.
Okay.
So the only men that got into lifeboats for the most part on the port side were crew members who were needed to row the lifeboats. But there is also some logic to this. A lot of people didn't want to get into the lifeboats right away because they didn't realize Titanic was really sinking. And it was very cold that night. The water was 28 degrees. People didn't want to get into a lifeboat in the dark and go down to the sea.
Right.
Let's just stay on the ship. And besides, there was a ship over in the distance that everybody could see. Its lights were burning. It looked to be about 5 miles away. So they're going to come to our rescue. So why would I get in a lifeboat?
Okay.
So why didn't that boat come to the rescue?
Very good story. Nobody knows 100% sure what boat that was, but it's pretty sure that it was a boat called the Californian. So the Californian had stopped a little bit earlier that evening because it was surrounded by ice. As a matter of fact, they sent the last message to the wireless operators on board Titanic telling them they were stopped because of the ice. But the telegraph operator on board Titanic, Jack Phillips, he had been working feverishly all day to send out messages because their telegraph actually broke earlier the day before, so they had a backlog of messages. So the Californian didn't have a wireless operator because Jack Phillips told him to shut up. So he turned off his wireless and he went to bed.
Oh, gosh.
And so even though the Titanic was firing flares, the Californian never responded because lots of things were happening that night. It was a very clear, moonless night. The sky was brilliant with stars. The sea was very calm like glass, which made it hard to see icebergs in the first place. But there's also an atmospheric condition that was going on. So these ships that saw each other from a distance, to one of them, the ship appeared farther away. To the other one, they appeared closer.
Okay.
So the Californian didn't think it was even the Titanic because it looked too small.
Right.
So there were a lot of issues on why it didn't come to the rescue. But even if it had tried to come right away when it found out Titanic was sinking, if they had the wireless on, they couldn't have gotten there in time because there was too much ice between them and they would have to have gone slowly to get there.
Right.
Yeah.
So it didn't seem like there was a ton of initial panic when they hit the iceberg then. Would you say it was an immediate response, or it took longer for people to realize what was going on? Or
It took quite a while for people to realize. You have to remember when you're in Titanic, especially if you're in the upper areas here, you know, down below to the sea level is 60 feet.
Okay.
And so when the iceberg struck right over here along the front of the ship, it graded along the bottom. And some people heard it, but it sounded more like a rumbling sound. The people up on the top parts of the ship didn't even really notice anything at all. So people didn't realize what was happening at first, and it took about over 2 hours for the ship to sink. So it wasn't until the ship actually started going like this that people really started to get worried. And by that point, a lot of the lifeboats had already left.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Now, did any boats come in after, like, to try to, like, I know in the movie, like, you see, like, it looks like people have come in to rescue them after, or does that not really happen?
Well, the first ship that was on the scene to rescue them was called the Carpathia.
Okay.
And they weren't in sight of the lifeboats until about an hour or so after Titanic sank, and they didn't start picking up passengers until about an hour after that to get close to them. Some other ships were in the area, including her sister ship, the Olympic, but she didn't arrive until much later, the day that she sank on April 15th. And then there was also another ship, I believe it was the Frankfurt, but don't quote me on that, that was in the area. But the only one that was close enough to really save anybody was the Carpathia.
Gotcha.
So did they end up pulling people who were in the water who had jumped out? Did they find any survivors?
The people who were in the lifeboats, some of them went back to look for survivors, but not many did.
Okay.
The reason being, and I think this was in the movie as well, the James Cameron version, is the crew members and the passengers were afraid when Titanic sank, she was going to create a suction pool, and that the lifeboats would be sucked down with the ship. So they wanted to get farther away. So by the time the ship sank and there was no suction, a few lifeboats did go back, but by that point, most of the people had already frozen to death.
So what was it like on the ship at the point when it was sinking? Was there anything going on, or?
Well, for the most part, people were praying.
Okay.
There was a priest on board who did last rites for a lot of the people. Obviously, the people who were up on the deck and there were no more lifeboats, one of the things they were doing was throwing chairs and anything that would float overboard, so when the ship sank, hopefully they can get on board one of those, which some of the people did. But for the most part, they all then huddled back in the stern, which is the rear of the boat, because that was the highest point, because the ship was actually going down, obviously like this.
Okay.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, the last person off the Titanic was the chief baker, Charles Joffin. And he was a really interesting guy, because Charles Joffin, he had 13 bakers under him, so a baker's dozen. It was kind of nice. But what he did is, as he realized the lifeboats were being lowered, he wanted to make sure that there were provisions on board. So even though there were some tins of biscuits and things, he got his 13 bakers together, he gave them loaves of bread, and he made sure that each lifeboat had loaves of bread in them. Another thing that he did was he made sure that women and children who didn't want to get into the boat, he would actually forcibly pick up some women and children and put them into the lifeboats, especially as it became clear that it sank. But one of the things that he did is he ended up back here on the railing, and he actually held onto the railing as the ship was going down, and he went down in the water with the ship, kind of like riding an elevator. As a matter of fact, it went down so smoothly, he didn't even get his hair wet.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did he eventually end up surviving, or no?
He did survive. He did survive. So let's see, how do we put this? He imbibed a little bit of some whiskey as he was doing this. So as he went down, he was feeling no pain. Let's put it that way. So he actually was in the water for 2 hours, treading water, holding on to an upside-down lifeboat until they finally made room for him to get on board. So he survived. He was the longest person to survive in the water, because most other people perished after only about 20 minutes.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, now with yourself being such an enthusiast, have you met any survivors or tried to contact them?
Well, obviously by the time 2002 came around, there weren't many survivors left.
True.
So the last person to pass away from Titanic was the youngest person on board. Her name was Milvina Dean. She was only 2 months old when Titanic sank.
Oh my gosh.
And so later in life, she became a bit of a celebrity once the James Cameron movie came out. So she passed away, I think, just about 5 years ago or so. So at the time that I was doing this in 2002, there was nobody left in the United States I could talk to, but I have talked to relatives of people who survived or were perished, because about 50 folks or so were from Ohio. So I've met some of their relatives both at the exhibition. I do talks at libraries and other events, so I've met them there as well.
Now, the necklace that's in the movie, did they really find that?
That's not a real necklace that would have been on board, but there was jewelry on board.
Okay.
And one of the things that the chief purser did, he's the person who kept all the valuables safe. When the wealthy passengers realized the ship was sinking, they started to kind of mob the purser's office to get their belongings. But he said, no, go back down to your cabins, get your life jackets, and get up to the lifeboats. So a lot of jewelry, expensive jewelry, did go down with the ship.
Gotcha.
Now, was any of that able to be recovered after the ship had sunk?
Well, you know that Dr. Ballard discovered the wreck of the Titanic back in 1985, and he didn't take anything from Titanic because he felt it was a grave site.
Right.
He did leave a memorial plaque on board the Titanic. But since then, there have been expeditions to bring artifacts back, which is why I did the presentation at the Great Lakes Science Center with the exhibition. So many personal belongings were found. Some of them were recovered, and then if you go to the exhibition, I think it just ended in Toledo, but there's also permanent exhibitions in Las Vegas, in Branson, Missouri, in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, and then other places throughout the world as well.
So what type of things would they show there? You said personal artifacts, what all?
You can show anything from a deck of cards. They have pieces of Titanic. There's a large metal piece from the actual hull of Titanic. Suitcases. I remember there was a perfume bottle that they recovered, or a perfume case, and you can still smell the perfume. So there are many different items, you know, like I said, both personal and that belonging to the ship that they brought up from the seabed. And this is actually funny because cards were a big deal on Titanic.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, the wealthy passengers liked to spend time up in the smoking lounges at the top, and there were card sharps, or what you might call sharks today, who are basically con men who were there to bilk the wealthy passengers off their money. And a very interesting thing about this is there's a very famous card sharp by the name of J. Yates, who is from Findlay, Ohio, which is over in western Ohio. So after the Titanic sank, a newspaper in New York received this note from supposedly somebody who had survived Titanic, and she wrote that this person gave her this note before she left on a lifeboat, because he was a man, and he was helping load women and children into the lifeboats and was a hero. Well, this man was J. Yates, and it said, you know, tell my mother I love her, etc., etc., etc. So they published these. You know, obviously, his mother was very distraught in Findlay, but he died a hero. Well, J. Yates was never on board Titanic. So he was wanted in Findlay, Ohio, and in the United States for various cons he had done. His last known residence was in London, and some people think that he set somebody else up to deliver that note to the newspaper in New York to get the feds off of his tail.
Oh, so he could essentially disappear.
He just disappeared. So he's the most famous person who wasn't on board Titanic.
Yeah. From right here in good old Ohio.
That's right.
Now, what are these like cups and like what is this thing that you brought?
This is